Eli felt the sting of humiliation burn across his face as the flight attendant pointed firmly to the isolated seat in the very last row, whispering, "We've had to reassign you back here due to your situation with being gay, sir," after that passenger's complaint. But when the wheels of the plane touched down at LaGuardia Airport in New York, the entire cabin stood up in a spontaneous wave of applause and cheers for the man who had just shown them all what true strength looked like. The 5-hour flight from Chicago had started so differently, with Eli clutching his boarding pass and thinking only of getting home to Benjamin after the worst weekend of his life. He had flown to Illinois alone because Benjamin's court schedule had kept him in Manhattan, but the plan was simple. Say goodbye to the father who had never really known him and return to the life they had built together. Instead, the visit had reopened every old wound. His father's cold stare at the kitchen table still echoed in Eli's mind as the plane taxied away from O'Hare. "I didn't raise a son to live like that," the old man had said, voice flat, before turning away. Eli had left the house without another word, chest tight, wondering why he had even tried. Now, wedged in the last row with his knees pressed against the seat in front, he stared out the tiny window and tried to breathe through the shame. The passenger who had complained, an older man in a business suit 3 rows up, had overheard Eli on his phone at the gate saying, "I love you, Benjamin, see you soon." That single sentence had been enough. The flight attendant's polite but firm tone still rang in his ears. "We just need to adjust for comfort, sir." Comfort. Eli almost laughed at the word. He pulled out his phone, switched it to airplane mode, and closed his eyes, but sleep refused to come. Instead, memories flooded in like the clouds rushing past the wing. He remembered the first time he had ever felt truly seen. It was 5 years earlier in a small community center in Brooklyn, rain hammering the windows, when a group for young professionals had gathered to talk about work-life balance. Eli had gone on a whim after a long day at the social services agency where he helped at-risk teens navigate their own coming-out stories. Across the circle sat Benjamin Rivera, tall and steady, with kind eyes and a quiet laugh that cut through the tension in the room. When it was Eli's turn to speak, he had stumbled over his words about balancing authenticity at work and the fear of losing clients. Benjamin had nodded, then shared his own story of leaving a big law firm because the partners made it clear they preferred traditional family men on the partner track. Their eyes had met, and something clicked. After the meeting, they grabbed coffee that turned into dinner, then a walk along the East River where Benjamin had asked, gently, "Have you ever felt like the world was waiting for you to apologize for who you love?" Eli had answered honestly for the first time in years. Every single day. That night they had talked until the sky lightened, and Eli knew he had found someone who understood the weight he carried. The memory brought a small smile to his lips even now, trapped in the back row. But the smile faded as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence and the seatbelt sign dinged on. He thought about the years that followed their meeting, how they had moved in together 6 months later into a tiny walk-up in Queens, how Benjamin had cooked Sunday pancakes while Eli read case files at the kitchen table. Their life was ordinary in the best way. Shared groceries, late-night talks about dreams, quiet support when the world pushed back. Yet the pushback had never stopped. Eli's thoughts drifted further back to the day he had finally told his parents he was gay. He was 22, fresh out of college, standing in the same Illinois kitchen with shaking hands. His mother had cried. His father had simply stared, then said, "We'll pray for you." Prayer had turned into silence, then distance, then years of holiday calls that grew shorter and shorter. Eli had stopped going home, choosing instead to build a chosen family with Benjamin and their close circle of friends. But the ache never fully left. A soft voice interrupted his reverie. The older woman in the seat beside him, mid-60s, silver hair pinned neatly, leaned over. "You okay, honey? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Eli hesitated, then nodded. "Long weekend. Family stuff." She smiled gently. "I've had a few of those. Name's Margaret. Traveling to see my grandkids." They chatted quietly, and Eli found himself opening up just a little, mentioning Benjamin without shame. Margaret's eyes softened. Sounds like a good man. For the first time since boarding, the knot in Eli's chest loosened a fraction. The plane continued its steady climb, and Eli let the memories continue to play like a film only he could see. He remembered the night 2 years ago when he had almost walked away from everything. The agency where he worked had faced budget cuts, and a colleague he trusted had leaked Eli's orientation to a conservative donor, costing the program vital funding. Eli had come home furious and defeated, telling Benjamin he was tired of fighting, tired of being the reason things fell apart. Maybe if I just toned it down, he had whispered in the dark. Benjamin had held him close and said, "You don't tone down who you are for anyone, not even me." That night had been a turning point. Eli had chosen to stay, to fight, to keep showing up as himself. The decision had cost him the job, but it had led him to start his own small nonprofit helping LGBTQ youth in the foster system. Benjamin had supported every late night, every grant application, every moment of doubt. Their love had grown stronger in the fire. Eli glanced up the aisle. The complaining passenger was reading a newspaper, oblivious. Eli wondered if the man had any idea how many lives were shaped by words like the ones he had spoken at the gate. The flight attendants moved through the cabin offering drinks. When one reached the back row, her eyes met Eli's briefly. There was a flicker of regret there, but she said nothing. Eli accepted a water and turned back to the window. The clouds below looked peaceful, but inside him the storm still raged. He thought of Benjamin waiting at LaGuardia, probably checking his watch and smiling that crooked smile Eli loved. They had plans for a quiet dinner, just the two of them, to process the weekend. Eli hoped he could find the words to describe the ache without letting it swallow him. Margaret patted his arm. "Whatever it is, you'll get through it. You seem like the kind of man who does." Eli managed a grateful nod. The plane leveled out, and for a moment the cabin felt almost calm. But Eli knew the real turbulence was still ahead. Not in the sky, but in the memories pressing against his heart. He closed his eyes again and let the story of his life with Benjamin unfold in his mind, one chapter at a time, because sometimes the only way forward was to remember how far you had already come. The memory of that almost breakup night pulled Eli deeper into the past as the plane hummed steadily eastward. He could still feel the cold hardwood floor under his bare feet as he had paced their Queens apartment, Benjamin watching from the couch with patient eyes. "I'm dragging you down," Eli had said, voice cracking. "Every time I push for us to be visible, something breaks." Benjamin had stood then, crossing the room in 3 strides, and taken Eli's hands. "You're not dragging me anywhere. You're the reason I finally stopped hiding at the firm. Remember when I told my senior partner I wouldn't take cases that required pretending I was single? That was because of you." Eli had cried that night, the kind of release that left him exhausted but lighter. Benjamin had made tea, and they had talked until dawn about the future they wanted. One where Eli's work with teens and Benjamin's advocacy in family law intersected to help more people than they could count. The next morning, Eli had applied for the grant that launched his nonprofit. Looking back now, wedged in the last row, Eli realized that moment had been the first real test of their partnership. Not the grand romantic gestures, but the quiet choice to keep building when everything urged them to quit. Margaret was knitting now, the soft click of needles a soothing rhythm. She glanced at him again. "You mentioned a Benjamin earlier." "Husband." Eli smiled despite himself. "Partner. 5 years now." "That's wonderful," she said warmly. "My late husband and I had 43. The good ones are worth every storm." Her words loosened something else in Eli, and he found himself sharing more. He told her about the day he and Benjamin had met at that Brooklyn Community Center, how Benjamin's calm presence had felt like an anchor in a room full of people still figuring themselves out. He described their first real date, a picnic in Prospect Park where Benjamin had brought homemade empanadas from his Puerto Rican grandmother's recipe, and they had talked about everything from childhood dreams to the books that had saved them. Eli had confessed he wanted to help kids who felt as lost as he once had. Benjamin had listened, then said, "Then do it. I'll be right there with you." The plane hit another small bump, and Eli gripped the armrest. Up ahead, the complaining passenger shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie. Eli wondered what story the man carried that made him so quick to judge. The thought led him further back, to the betrayal at his old agency. His colleague Derek had seemed like a friend, shared lunches, weekend softball games. Then one afternoon Derek had accidentally forwarded an email chain that included Eli's personal details to the board. Funding dried up within weeks. Eli had confronted him, and Derek had shrugged. "It's just business. People get nervous." The memory still stung. Eli had walked out that day and never returned. Benjamin had been the one to pick up the pieces, helping Eli draft the business plan for the new organization while working extra hours at the law firm to cover rent. "We'll make it," Benjamin had promised. "Your work matters too much to let them win." Those words had carried Eli through the hardest months. He thought now about the teens he had helped since then. Kids like Marcus, who had shown up at the shelter last year terrified to tell his parents he was gay. Eli had sat with him for hours, sharing pieces of his own story without ever naming names, and Marcus had eventually gone home with a plan. Benjamin had met the boy once and later told Eli, "You're changing lives one conversation at a time. Never doubt that." The cabin lights dimmed slightly for the midday flight, and a few passengers dozed. Eli's thoughts turned to the family visit that had just ended. His father's funeral had been small, only a handful of relatives. Eli had stood at the graveside feeling like an intruder in his own grief. Afterward, his aunt had pulled him aside. "He never stopped loving you, Eli. He just didn't know how to say it." The words had offered little comfort. On the drive to the airport, Eli had called Benjamin, voice thick. "I wanted him to see the man I became. The man you helped me become." Benjamin's reply had been steady. "He missed out. But I see you. Every day." Now, thousands of feet above the Midwest, Eli felt the weight of that conversation settle differently. Maybe reconciliation wasn't always loud. Maybe it was the quiet decision to keep loving anyway. Margaret set her knitting aside. "You're awfully quiet over there. Want to talk about it?" Eli surprised himself by answering, "My dad passed. We weren't close. Because of me being gay." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry. Families can be complicated. But the family you choose, that's what counts." Her kindness felt like a small light in the dim cabin. Eli thanked her and leaned back, letting the memories continue. He recalled the night Benjamin had proposed, not with a ring, but with matching keys to a bigger apartment in Astoria and a handwritten letter listing 100 reasons he wanted to build a life together. They had celebrated with takeout on the floor, laughing until they cried. That apartment had become their sanctuary, filled with photos of their trips to the Grand Canyon, their friends' weddings, and the quiet evenings where they simply existed side by side. Eli's nonprofit had grown too, now mentoring over 50 young people each year. Benjamin's law practice focused on adoption and custody cases for LGBTQ families. Their lives had intertwined so completely that Eli sometimes forgot how lonely the world had felt before. A flight attendant passed with the beverage cart again, and this time she paused longer at Eli's row. "Everything all right back here?" Her voice was softer than before. Eli nodded. "Getting there." She offered him an extra packet of pretzels with a small, apologetic smile. Maybe the cabin wasn't as hostile as he had first thought. The plane droned on, and Eli felt the past and present blurring together. He was no longer just the man in the back row. He was the boy who had come out at 22, the partner who had almost walked away, the social worker who refused to hide. And somewhere above the clouds, he was beginning to understand that every scar had led him exactly here, to this moment, to Benjamin waiting at the gate, to a life that was undeniably his own. The conversation with Margaret faded into comfortable silence, But Eli's mind kept traveling back, tracing the jagged path that had brought him to this seat. He remembered the exact afternoon 3 years ago when the betrayal at work had forced him to make the hardest choice of his adult life. He had sat in the agency director's office, staring at the spreadsheet that showed their funding slashed by 40%. "It's not personal," the director had said, but her eyes had said otherwise. Derek's leak had done its damage. Eli had walked out into the Brooklyn rain and called Benjamin from a coffee shop, voice shaking. "I think I have to quit. I can't keep asking these kids to be brave if I'm hiding myself." Benjamin had left a client meeting immediately, meeting Eli at their favorite bench in Prospect Park. They had sat under the dripping trees while Benjamin listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, Benjamin had simply said, "Then we start something new. Together." That same week Eli had filed the paperwork for his nonprofit. Benjamin had spent nights reviewing contracts and grant applications after long days at the firm. Their tiny kitchen table became command central, covered in sticky notes and coffee mugs. Friends pitched in too, some donating time, others spreading the word. The first year had been brutal. Eli had taken odd consulting gigs to keep food on the table while Benjamin covered the rent. There were nights Eli lay awake wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. But Benjamin never wavered. "You're building something that matters," he would whisper in the dark. "I'm proud of you." Those words had become Eli's lifeline. As the plane crossed into Ohio airspace, Eli smiled at the memory of their first major grant approval. They had celebrated with cheap champagne on the rooftop, Benjamin spinning Eli around under the city lights until they were both dizzy with hope. The nonprofit had grown from there, one teen at a time. Eli thought of Sarah, who had arrived last winter with a black eye and a story about her stepfather's rage. Eli had helped her find safe housing and connected her with a therapist who understood. Months later Sarah had sent him a photo of her high school graduation, captioning it, "Thank you for showing me I could be me." Eli had shown Benjamin the message over dinner, and they had both cried quietly at the kitchen table. Those moments made every sacrifice worth it. But growth had come with new pressures. Eli had started receiving speaking invitations, small panels at first, then larger conferences. Each time he stood in front of an audience and said the words, "As a gay man who works with queer youth," he felt the old fear rise. Benjamin would sit in the back row every time, offering a thumbs up that grounded him. Yet not everyone celebrated their visibility. Eli recalled the night a brick had shattered their apartment window with a note that simply read, "Go back where you came from." The police had taken a report, but the fear had lingered. Benjamin had replaced the glass the next day and installed a security camera without complaint. "We don't run," he had said. That quiet strength had become the foundation of their relationship. Eli glanced at his watch. 3 hours left in the flight. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Instead, he thought about the family dynamics he had tried so hard to fix. His mother had passed 2 years earlier. Her last words to him over the phone a soft, "I love you, baby. Be happy." His father had stopped answering calls after that. The funeral invitation had arrived in a plain envelope with no personal note. Eli had debated going for weeks. Benjamin had offered to fly with him, but a major case had made it impossible. "I'll be with you in spirit," Benjamin had promised at the airport drop-off, kissing him goodbye in front of the security line. The weekend had been a blur of polite condolences and awkward silences. At the wake, a cousin had asked, "Still living in New York with your friend?" Eli had answered evenly, "With my partner, yes." The conversation had died there. Now, sitting in the back of the plane, Eli wondered if any of them would ever understand the life he had chosen. Margaret stirred beside him. "You look deep in thought again." Eli chuckled softly. "Just remembering how I got here." She listened as he shared bits of the nonprofit story, her eyes widening with genuine interest. "You sound like a man who turned pain into purpose." Her words landed like a bomb. For the first time since the demotion, Eli felt a spark of pride instead of shame. The plane began its slow descent toward the east coast, and the cabin lights brightened. Passengers started stirring, gathering belongings. Eli checked his phone again out of habit, though it was still in airplane mode. He imagined Benjamin's text waiting on the other side. "Can't wait to see you, love." The thought warmed him, but the memory of the brick through the window resurfaced, reminding him that safety was never guaranteed. He and Benjamin had talked about moving to a quieter neighborhood, maybe even buying a small house someday. They had laughed about backyard barbecues and adopting a dog. Those dreams felt possible now, after everything they had survived. Eli thought about the internal war he had waged during that first year of the nonprofit. Nights when doubt whispered that he was selfish for choosing love over family approval. Mornings when he stared in the mirror and wondered if he would ever feel whole. Benjamin had never pushed, only listened and loved. One particularly dark evening Eli had said, "What if I'm too broken for this?" Benjamin had pulled him close and answered, "Then we'll fix it together, piece by piece." That promise had carried them through. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom announcing the start of descent. Eli fastened his seat belt tighter and watched the clouds thin out below. Somewhere down there was the city they called home, the place where their story had taken root and flourished despite every obstacle. He thought of the framed photo on their dresser. The two of them on their third anniversary, arms around each other on the Brooklyn Bridge, smiling like the future was already won. Eli realized now that the future had never been about winning. It was about choosing each other every single day. Margaret folded her knitting and offered him a piece of chocolate from her bag. "For the landing jitters," she said with a wink. He accepted it gratefully. As the plane angled downward, Eli felt the pieces of his life clicking into place. The rejection from his father, the betrayal at work, the quiet strength of Benjamin. They had all shaped him into the man who could sit in this back row without breaking. He still didn't know why the cabin would later stand for him, but in that moment he felt ready for whatever came next. The ground rose to meet them, and Eli closed his eyes, sending a silent message to Benjamin across the miles. "I'm coming home." The plane continued its descent, and Eli's thoughts turned to the sacrifices that had tested their bond most deeply. He remembered the evening Benjamin had come home from the law firm looking exhausted, tie loosened, and announced he had turned down a partnership offer. "They wanted me to take on more corporate clients, ones that don't align with the work we're doing," Benjamin had explained over Chinese takeout. Eli had stared at him in disbelief. "But that was your dream." Benjamin had shrugged, smiling softly. "My dream changed when I met you. I'd rather fight for families like ours than chase a corner office." That choice had meant tighter budgets and longer hours for both of them, but it had also brought them closer. They had started volunteering together at a local youth center, Eli leading group sessions while Benjamin offered free legal clinics. The teens adored them, calling them the dads behind their backs. Those nights had healed something in Eli that years of therapy never quite reached. He thought about the misunderstanding that had nearly torn them apart 6 months after starting the nonprofit. Eli had been invited to speak at a national conference in Washington, D.C. Benjamin had encouraged him to go alone, saying the exposure would help the organization. But during the trip, Eli had received a late-night call from an old college friend warning him that rumors were spreading online about their relationship. Ugly comments questioning Benjamin's motives for staying with someone like Eli. Eli had panicked, convinced the publicity would hurt Benjamin's career. He had texted Benjamin from the hotel, "Maybe we should keep things quieter for a while." The reply had come instantly, "Come home and we'll talk." When Eli returned, they had stayed up until sunrise. Benjamin had taken his hands and said, "I didn't fall in love with a version of you. I fell in love with all of you. If the world has a problem with that, we face it together." Eli had cried then, realizing how close he had come to letting fear win again. They had renewed their commitment that night, deciding to post a simple photo of the two of them on social media with the caption, "Proud to do this life together." The response had been overwhelmingly positive, bringing new donors and supporters. The memory made Eli smile now as the plane banked gently. He glanced up the aisle and noticed the complaining passenger talking quietly with his wife. The man's posture seemed less rigid. Maybe the hours in the air had softened something. Margaret noticed Eli watching and whispered, "People surprise you sometimes." Eli nodded, thinking of all the surprises Benjamin had brought into his life. Their second anniversary trip to the Grand Canyon had been one. Benjamin had planned the entire thing in secret, including a sunrise hike where he had read a poem he wrote about finding home in another person. Eli had proposed they get matching tattoos afterward, small coordinates of the spot where they had stood together. The ink still felt like a promise every time he looked at his wrist. The plane's engines shifted pitch as they approached New York. Eli's heart quickened, not from fear of landing but from anticipation of seeing Benjamin's face at the gate. He imagined the hug that would erase the weekend's pain, the quiet car ride home where they would talk about everything and nothing. The nonprofit was hosting a fundraiser next month, and Benjamin had already promised to speak. Their life was full in ways Eli had once believed impossible. Yet the internal voices still whispered sometimes. On bad days, Eli wondered if his father's rejection had left a crack that could never fully heal. Benjamin had a way of quieting those voices with a single look or a gentle reminder. "You are enough exactly as you are." Eli thought about the day he had introduced Benjamin to his mother before she passed. She had been frail in her hospital bed, but had taken Benjamin's hand and said, "Take care of my boy." Benjamin had promised her he would, and he had kept that promise every day since. The cabin crew began preparing for landing, collecting trash and checking seatbelts. Eli fastened his and took a deep breath. He realized the flight had become more than transportation. It had become a space where his entire journey had replayed itself, reminding him of every choice, every tear, every triumph. He no longer felt small in the back row. He felt anchored by the love he was flying toward. Margaret leaned over one last time. "Whatever happens when we land, remember you're not alone." Her words felt prophetic. Eli thanked her sincerely, then turned to watch the familiar skyline emerge through the clouds. The plane touched down smoothly, and the cabin erupted in applause. Not for the pilot, but for something else entirely. Eli's confusion lasted only seconds as passengers began turning toward him, clapping and nodding with respect he hadn't expected. The complaining passenger stood first, his wife beside him, both clapping steadily. Margaret joined in, smiling widely. The flight attendant who had reassigned him earlier now stood at the front of the aisle, eyes misty, leading the ovation. Eli sat frozen, heart pounding, as the realization slowly dawned. His quiet conversations, the story he had lived, the kindness he had shown even after humiliation. Somehow it had rippled through the cabin while he was lost in memory. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Folks, we've just been made aware of the incredible work one of our passengers does every day for young people who need it most. Eli, thank you for reminding us what courage looks like." The applause grew louder. Eli stood slowly, legs unsteady, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Tears pricked his eyes as he gathered his bag. When the doors opened, the line of passengers waited so he could exit first, many reaching out to shake his hand or offer quiet words of thanks. He stepped onto the jetway feeling lighter than he had in years. And there, at the gate, stood Benjamin. Tall, steady, eyes shining with pride because someone had already shown him the video that had spread through the cabin Wi-Fi. Benjamin opened his arms, and Eli walked straight into them, the noise of the terminal fading as they held each other. "I heard," Benjamin whispered against his hair. "You did it again." Turned pain into something beautiful. Eli pulled back just enough to look into the face he loved most. "We did it. Together." They walked out of the airport hand in hand, the applause still echoing in Eli's ears like a promise that the world could change, one flight at a time. The drive home from LaGuardia felt like a dream Eli never wanted to wake from. Benjamin drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on Eli's knee, the city lights of Queens blurring past the windows. "Tell me everything," Benjamin said softly, and Eli did, starting with the demotion and ending with the standing ovation. Benjamin listened without interrupting, his thumb tracing gentle circles on Eli's jeans. When Eli finished, Benjamin pulled into a quiet parking spot overlooking the East River and turned to face him fully. "I'm so proud of you. Not because of the applause, but because you never stopped being you." Eli felt the last of the weekend's weight lift. They sat there talking for nearly an hour, replaying the flight, the memories, the way one small act of dignity had shifted an entire cabin. Benjamin shared how a fellow passenger had live-streamed the moment and tagged the nonprofit, already bringing in new donations. "Your story is reaching people, Eli. Just like you always hoped." They finally drove the last few blocks to their apartment, where Benjamin had prepared a simple dinner. Pasta with the sauce Eli loved, candles on the table. Over the meal they made plans for the future. Expanding the nonprofit to include legal workshops, maybe taking that long-delayed vacation to Puerto Rico so Eli could meet more of Benjamin's family. The conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and the comfortable silences that only years of shared life could create. Later that night, lying in bed with Benjamin's arm around him, Eli stared at the ceiling and whispered, "I thought the rejection would break me this time. But sitting in that back row, I realized I'm not defined by who turned away. I'm defined by who stayed." Benjamin kissed his forehead. "And I'm never going anywhere." The next morning, Eli woke to sunlight streaming through the blinds and the smell of coffee. Benjamin was already up, reading the comments on the video that had gone mildly viral overnight. "Listen to this one," he said, grinning. "A dad wrote that he's going to talk to his son tonight because of what he saw on that plane." Eli joined him at the kitchen table, and together they read message after message from strangers whose hearts had been touched. The outpouring felt surreal, yet it confirmed what Eli had always believed. Stories had power. Over the following weeks, the ripple effects continued. The nonprofit's phone rang constantly with new volunteers. A major foundation reached out about funding. Even Eli's aunt called from Illinois, voice hesitant but warm, saying she had seen the video and wanted to visit New York soon. "Your father would be proud if he could see this," she added quietly. Eli didn't know if that was true, but he accepted the olive branch anyway. Benjamin's firm offered him a new role focused entirely on pro bono LGBTQ cases, a direct result of the publicity. They celebrated that night with friends, laughter filling their living room as everyone toasted to unexpected turning points. Eli watched Benjamin across the room and felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears. This was the life they had chosen. Imperfect, sometimes painful, but undeniably theirs. Months later, on the anniversary of that fateful flight, Eli and Benjamin returned to LaGuardia. Not to travel, but to meet a group of teens from the nonprofit for a special tour. As they walked through the terminal, Eli paused at the gate where it had all begun. A young girl from the program tugged his sleeve. "Is this where everyone clapped for you?" Eli smiled and nodded. "It is. But the real story started long before that." He glanced at Benjamin, who was helping another teen with a boarding pass, and felt the full circle complete. Later that evening, back home, Eli stood on their small balcony overlooking the city lights. Benjamin joined him, wrapping arms around his waist from behind. "What are you thinking?" Eli turned in the embrace. "That every hard choice led me here. To you. To us." They kissed under the stars, the kind of kiss that carried 5 years of shared battles and victories. The world had not become perfect overnight, but it had grown kinder in small, measurable ways. And Eli knew, deep in his bones, that their story was far from over. It was simply beginning a new chapter, one written with courage, love, and the quiet certainty that they would face whatever came next together. The months that followed the flight brought changes neither Eli nor Benjamin had anticipated. Eli's nonprofit expanded into a second location in Brooklyn, thanks in large part to the donations that continued to arrive from people who had seen the video. Teens who once felt alone now walked through the doors knowing someone had stood up for them, even if that someone had started by sitting in the back row of a plane. Eli found himself mentoring more personally, sharing pieces of his journey without ever glamorizing the pain. Benjamin balanced his new pro bono role with evening sessions where he taught the teens about their legal rights, his steady presence a constant source of stability. One Saturday afternoon, they hosted a small barbecue in their building's courtyard. Friends, colleagues, and several of the older teens attended. Laughter floated on the summer air as stories were swapped and plates passed. Eli watched Benjamin flip burgers with the same focused care he brought to everything, and his heart swelled. Later, when the crowd thinned, Benjamin pulled Eli aside near the fence lined with string lights. "Remember when you thought the world was too heavy?" he asked softly. Eli nodded, throat tight. "I don't think that anymore." They stood there a long time, simply holding each other while the city hummed around them. The following winter brought another milestone. Eli's aunt visited from Illinois, bringing a box of his mother's old letters. They read them together at the kitchen table, tears mixing with smiles as memories surfaced. Benjamin sat quietly, offering support without needing to speak. When the aunt left, she hugged Eli tightly. "You've built something beautiful," she whispered. "Keep going." That night, Eli and Benjamin talked about starting a family of their own someday, fostering or adopting one of the teens who needed a permanent home. The conversation felt natural, full of hope rather than fear. Spring arrived with new energy. The nonprofit hosted its largest fundraiser yet, and Eli stood on stage to thank everyone. Benjamin watched from the front row, pride shining in his eyes. After the event, they walked home through the streets they loved, hand in hand, no longer caring who saw. Life continued its steady rhythm of work, laughter, and quiet nights in. Eli still had moments when old doubts crept in, but now he recognized them for what they were, echoes, not truths. Benjamin's unwavering love had become the mirror that reflected Eli's worth back to him every single day. On the one-year anniversary of the flight, they returned to LaGuardia once more. This time as passengers themselves, heading to Puerto Rico for the vacation they had long promised. As they boarded, the flight attendant recognized Eli and offered them upgraded seats with a warm smile. Eli laughed softly and declined. "We're good right here," he said, settling into row 20 with Benjamin beside him. The plane lifted off, and Eli looked out the window at the city shrinking below. He thought of the man he had been the last time he sat in the back of a plane, hurting, uncertain, carrying the weight of rejection. That man had become someone stronger, someone loved, someone who had learned that courage wasn't loud applause but the daily choice to keep showing up. Benjamin squeezed his hand. "Ready for new memories?" Eli turned, meeting the eyes that had anchored him through every storm. "With you? Always." The plane climbed higher, carrying them toward sunshine and possibility. Below, the world kept turning, full of people still learning, still growing, still capable of surprising one another with kindness. Eli closed his eyes, grateful for the journey that had brought him here and for the man who had walked every step beside him. True or false, one public act of support can completely rewrite the narrative of a lifetime of prejudice.